I never felt ashamed of riding a bicycle, or they didn't feel proud of riding a Rolls Royce. Lahore was a very sad town to come back to. I was very unhappy in Lahore.
Hello everyone, my name is Samal Naseem. I'm an assistant professor of economics at LUMS. We're going to be speaking today to Babar Saab about his education from Aitchison up till his time in the US. It's a pleasure speaking to you, Babar Saab. Thank you for sparing time to talk to us. So my first question, Babar Saab, is you spent your formative years at Aitchison College. Could you take us through your time at Aitchison?
Well, looking back on it, I think they were the best years of my life. I joined in, Aitchison was a school, started at the age of 8. They admitted students at the age of 8. And in those days, Queen Mary College was the preparatory school for people to come into Aitchison College. It was at that time a chief's college, where sons of the feudal class of northern India were admitted, and the reason it was called chief's college was these young men were to be groomed to be loyal citizens of the British, and through these young men, when they grow up, they would control whatever area they came from. So we had people from just north of Delhi up to Chitral in the north, and down to Lasbela in the south. And half the students were non-Muslims, mostly Sikhs, but they were, I would say, about 1/4 were Hindus. They came from these hill states, the Kangra, Kullu hill states, right. Because almost every village had a Raja, so they had some kind of a title and all that. So it was the Aitchison College at that time. The whole purpose was really to equip you with the 3 R's, and not to make scholars out of you, but to make gentlemen out of you, because in those days, later on, it was the equivalent of O and A level was introduced through senior Cambridge and higher school certificate from the Cambridge University. In those days, it used to be a diploma of the chiefs colleges of India, and that was sort of a terminal degree to enable these people to go into politics or into jobs in government or whatever it was. That was, and it was good enough for people to get admitted to Oxford and Cambridge at that time, this diploma from the chiefs colleges, because many of my seniors, take Nawab Bhattodi, he went to Oxford, and many of the others, but most of the other people went back to their states to be groomed up to be the future rulers, or went into government service. They were inducted directly into the PCS, the provincial service, or went back to their lands to look after their property. But the teachers that we had at Aitchison College were not scholars, but they were good tutors. They watched you, your behavior, the way you conducted yourself, both in the classroom, in your boarding house, and on the playing field. People were admitted to Aitchison College who were in the book called The Chiefs of Punjab. My family was not there, but I was smuggled into the college through my mamu was there, Fakir Sirajuddin. He was my mother's brother. And the 9 years I spent there, I loved every minute of it, because I was very keen on not only the classroom, what happened outside the classroom. We used to have debating society. We had what they call the Council of States. It was a parliament, mock parliament, where half the students after the age of, say, 12 or 13 were made members of the parliament. and half the students were in the opposition and the other half on the government side. You had a minister, you had the prime minister, you had a leader of the opposition, kind of grooming you for, if you went, if you went into the legislature, you were prepared for that. And this was taken very seriously. You were asked to speak on this thing, you moved a bill and all that kind of thing. It was, at the age of, while you are still in your teens, you were being groomed as to how you conduct yourself in the assembly. Then on the playing field, almost every teacher that we had had a skill. Either is a hockey player from government college or represented the university, or was a tennis player. I remember our tennis players were Prem Pandey, was one of the leading tennis players of his time in Pakistan. Another was Mr. Sabara. He was captain of the London University tennis team. So there was and so the teachers were watching you in the classroom, on the playing field, how you behaved yourself, how you conducted yourself. So it was a wonderful way. And then the thing that really I benefited for a lot was, apart from the guidance of the teachers and their mentoring, was the friends I made. My mother was very particular that she wanted to meet all my friends. So they invited, she was keen to invite them over to the house to meet them. And she said, "Iske ghar tum ja sakte ho, iske ghar nahi ja sakte." So she was very particular on that. And my closest friend was a Sikh gentleman, Harcharan. And we remained friends for 70 years till he passed away. He was my closest friend, and now we are friends with his daughter and all that kind of thing. So the bonding that you had with the Aitchisonians was unique, and it was not based on any benefit accruing to anybody. The fact that you were an Aitchisonian, you belong to that larger family. So that is, and I owe it a lot. And the other thing that was very important was your participating in physical exercise, riding, swimming, of course swimming during the summer, riding all the year round, then tennis, cricket. Football was not a popular game at Aitchison, but hockey was, tennis of course, and I played tennis. I rode almost for 50 years after I left Aitchison, and I still exercise. I walk every day because of Aitchison College. I don't want to throw names, but I had the future Raja of Chamba as my classmate, the future Raja of Poonch as my classmate, the future Nawab of Bahawalpur as my classmate. I remember the Patiala boys used to have gold mohurs on their buttons. The Chamba heir apparent had gems in his kulla, but nothing beyond that. The Patiala boys used to stay in a place called Patiala House, which was where the Pearl Continental today is. It was called Bishop's Stowe. And they used to come in a Rolls Royce. Nobody bothered about it. I used to come on a bicycle. That, I never felt ashamed of riding a bicycle, or they didn't feel proud of riding a Rolls Royce. It was a vehicle. But you never sort of, paid any attention to where they came from. You knew they came from an important family, but as far as playing field is concerned, you bullied them as much as you bullied anybody else, or you got bullied yourself. So that was a very evening kind of a attitude. There was no reverence to anybody, or nobody deferred to anybody. And as far as we had housemasters who were chosen to be good, again good mentors. How you behave yourself at the table. We all ate together, and the general conduct, how you interacted with each other. So they were all, the emphasis was build up a good gentleman kind of person coming out of Aitchison College with good values. Not that everybody imbibed that, but certainly many of us gained from that.
Are there any teachers who stand out? You said that the teachers
Yeah.
acted more like tutors.
Every teacher I, kept in touch with many of them. I left in '43, so but I kept in touch with Aitchison. After leaving Aitchison, I used to go back, but more so after partition. During partition, I was studying myself at Government College, then I went abroad. But the ones that stayed on in Pakistan, I used to be in touch with them. When they retired from Aitchison College, I used to go and see them, or they used to come and visit with me. And it was a wonderful relationship. There was Khan Anwar Sikandar Khan who taught us Persian and Urdu. He later on was asked to go and set up Sadiq Public School in Bahawalpur. He became the principal there, and after he retired from there, he came to Lahore, and I treated my teachers as my own father, gave them the same respect and the same kind of reverence, and they treated me like their own sons. So it was very mutual. This is Zulfikar Ali Shah, who at the end became the principal at Aitchison College. When he retired from Aitchison College, I requested him to come and spend time my father had just passed away, so I said, we need an elder person in our company. Why don't you come and sit with us? So he had a room 2 doors away from mine, and he stayed there for the rest of his life. He was with us. And a number of other teachers went and started new schools. Mr. Abdur Rahman, he was a very good athlete and a good teacher in history. He went and set up the public school at Aptabad. He was the first headmaster there, and we put it up, the same kind of blueprint as Aitchison College. Not the buildings, but the way that the students and the teachers conducted themselves. So Aitchison played a very big role in setting up of some other public schools in Pakistan, particularly Sadiq Public School and the one in Aptabad.
So you've been actively involved in the school through the ages. How has the school evolved or changed over time, or since you left?
Well, it started changing in my time. It became a public school. I mean, in 1936-37, Mr. Barry, who was the principal at that time, realized that the school could not sustain itself on the basis of just the chiefs of Punjab. It had to open it up to other people, and so then whoever could afford to send their sons, provided they came from the, had right credentials, they got in. So it became a public school. I remember we had a holiday when we were 106 students on the roll. That was the highest number that Aitchison ever had. So we had a holiday, and we all went to Sheikhupura. Our guest was Raja of Sheikhupura, was an old student. But later on, the number grew into by leaps and bounds. Now it's 2,800, and now it has been. Then they, during later years after partition, they set up the junior school, and then the prep school, and then of course the senior school. We now have the 3 schools, and it's totally changed in its makeup. And people are coming from all over the country. One role that Aitchison played, which I'm very keen that we continue to do that, it's not happening to the same extent, that it was a national institution. When I was there, we had Akbar Bukti there, and Sherbaz Mazari, and Mari was there. So there was total harmony and comradeship. There was no provincialism. And pre-partition, there was no religion on the campus at all. The Muslims were only half at best. There were Sikhs and Hindus, as I mentioned. And we had a mosque, we had a mandar, we had a gurdwara. Students went to their own, to their particular place of worship. But in the classroom or otherwise, there was no favoritism. You never chose your friends because of his religion or his belief. You chose him because those who had similar values, that's how you selected your friends. So that was a very wonderful. Now I'm agitating with the government and with the principal and others. Principal is very supportive of this, that we need to get more students from Balochistan, from Sindh, interior Sindh, not just Karachi, from the frontier. We get a good number from the frontier, but we used to get it from Chitral, Swat, so that when these people grow up, the idea really that still Aitchison can play a very big role in the future building up of Pakistan, that they recognize each other, they are friends with each other, respect each other, whether they are in government or opposition, they know how to deal with each other in a civilized manner. And this is something which needs to be inculcated, promoted, and developed.
Babar Saab, a popular critique of Aitchison is that it caters to the elite and reproduces class and power structures that inhibit social evolution. To what extent do you think this critique holds substance?
Well, I mean, that is true because Aitchison doesn't have any bursary or any scholarships. People who can afford to pay, they send their children. And that is why we are trying to raise an endowment to get students from other provinces who may not be able to afford to send their sons here. There are plenty of Punjabis at Aitchison College. I wouldn't like to give any scholarships to any Punjabi. You see, what the other thing that is happening is that today the whole attitude of the parents towards education is becoming very mercenary. I mean, they are so grade conscious. In the last few weeks, my life has been hell here. Mothers coming to agitate with me that their sons have not under this COVID, there are no examinations, so the grading has been done on the past record of their sons. And they've been agitating that their sons should get more marks than what they have been allotted. In my days, it was unthinkable that my father could ever go to the college to talk to the principal as to how I was doing at studies. He was not even, I mean, he couldn't care less what I studied so long as I went to school. And today, the parents are so sort of keen on their sons being at the top of the class, whether they deserve it or not. And it's a very sad development today. Yesterday, somebody was telling me that apart from the fees that they spend to send their son to Aitchison, they are spending 3 or 4 times that amount in running, sending their sons to tuitions, where they learn nothing. So there is a whole, need to have a kind of overhaul of the attitude of the parents as to how they should bring up their sons. I hope they do the same with the daughters also. So there is enough of grooming to be done with the boys. I tell you, we at LUMS, for instance, we have less problem with the girls' behavior than with the boys' behavior. Because generally speaking, girls are, I would say, better groomed, better educated, how to conduct themselves in a co-ed environment. Even though I think 90% of the girls that come to LUMS come from a single gender background.
Okay, Babar Saab, so you moved to government college after completing your education at Aitchison. How was that transition?
I was very disappointed because we were brought up in tremendous luxury at Aitchison, a big campus and all that. And when you went across to government college, one heard a lot about government college, but government college had a mixed bag of students coming from different walks of life. Their general behavior, conduct, language was different to what I was used to. But I stayed in government college for about a year and a half. I joined in January and left in May the following year after having taken my BSc examination. But there I had a lot of respect for teachers. We had very good quality teachers, professors. For instance, in Urdu we had Sufi Ghulam Mustafa Tabassum. In chemistry we had Professor Mahasingh and Professor Puri, Professor Agarwal. In chemistry we had Professor Sarna, Professor Seth, and Professor Chabda. So they were all very scholarly. They were completely sort of rooted in their subject. They treated you with the kindness. They made sure that you understood what they were trying to convey to you. Rote learning was not encouraged in government college. It was a good lesson, good transition, and that helped me with the next step that I took when I went abroad for studies, because they were more, akin to what government college was like as compared to what Aitchison. Aitchison College was a bubble and a cocoon.
Right, right. You mentioned some interesting anecdotes in your book about government college. So, any dalliances or heartbreaks at the college?
No, but we had friends who were. There was a small group of students from Doon School, and Doon School was the rival school of Aitchison College. So the Doon School students felt that they were one step above or better than us. So they were chasing the girls. And one fellow, one of the Doon School boys, married Professor Sondhi's daughter, Sonu Sondhi. And of course, Professor Saraj married one of his students, the elder daughter. She was a very fine lady. I was joking with Mrs. Rahman the other day. I said, in my days at government college, half the boys were in love with one sister and the other half with the other sister. So she said, who were you in love with? I said, both the sisters. So it was a good environment, and Professor Sondhi was a wonderful, he was a giant among educationalists.
Right. You also mentioned your vacations in Bhopal during that time. Could you tell us a little bit about
Bhopal, my family had a fairly large business in Bhopal, and I had just sort of in between holidays and after I had finished my studies at government college, my elders had acquired a large landed property there, so they had nobody from the family to look after it. They said, why don't you you studied agriculture at Aitchison College, so why don't you go and practice what you learned at Aitchison? And it was quite a learning experience. It was a very interesting environment. It was about 70 miles away from Bhopal, the big city. This was in a kind of out in the boondocks, a large tract of land, 2,000 acres of irrigated land, and it had 8,000 acres of forest land. So that was very attractive because there was a lot of shikar in that area, and I was keen on hunting then. So it was, and Bhopal, of course, had another culture altogether. As you know, it was being ruled by a Muslim ruler, and the main population was Hindu. But it was a very benevolent kind of ruler. Hindus were not discriminated against. There were Hindus who were in high position in government and in administration. Of course, Nawab Bhopal himself was educated at Aligarh University, so he brought a lot of Allegorians to Bhopal to help him run that place. He was himself a good sportsman, a cricketer, so he brought in the famous Wazir Ali and Nazir Ali, the two cricketers who used to play for the Muslims in the Pentangular. They were in Bhopal, and then of course the Bhopal Wanderers hockey team was one of the top hockey teams of India, and they used to have an annual hockey tournament there where they invited top hockey teams of India to come and play there. So it was a small state, but did more than most of other states of India because of a very progressive ruler who had been to a public school, a public university like Aligarh University. And so one interacted with many of their leaders and their ministers, and they were all very accessible. There was no snootiness about them. It was a very egalitarian society.
What made you decide to go to the US for higher studies, and how did your friends and family feel about this decision?
Yeah, well, and we because the family was in business, and to them a BA was enough of a degree. Why do I need another degree? I said no, I want to study more, and a new subject appeared on the horizon for businessmen to study was business, business administration. This was something that had been evolved on the American campuses. And I had finished in 1945, the year the war was over. And Europe was totally destroyed, including England. And nobody thought of going to England because there was so much of misery there. There was so much starvation. There was food shortages, shortage of everything. And America was, as you know, had stayed out of the war and had benefited from it. And some of, one friend of mine, my classmate, went to America for studies. So we were in Bombay, we went to see him off, and then my father came and told my mother, which I overheard, it's not possible to retain him anymore. His friend has gone to America. So then I went to town and sending applications to various American universities. Meanwhile, I had some friends who had gone from government college to American universities on government scholarships. So I was seeking their guidance as to how to apply and what to do. And University of Michigan was the first one that sent me an admission note. So I said, here I go. I was very keen to go to MIT, but I couldn't get admission there because I didn't meet their criteria.
Right. Was this your first journey outside of British India?
Yes, absolutely. The first time I left home. And in those days, planes were not flying across continents. You had to go by boat to England, and then you cross the Atlantic by another ship. So that again was quite an ordeal and a learning, because all these ships plying at that time had been converted from passenger boats into troop ships. So a single or a double bed cabin was converted into a 6 or a 7 bed bunkers. We had 2 or 3 steel beds, one above the other, to accommodate troops going across the Atlantic. And this is how we traveled to England and then across to America.
So let's break up your ship journey into 3 parts. First, take us through your trip from Bombay to England. Actually, as a matter of fact, let's start from Lahore to Bombay. How did you get to Bombay? How did your family feel about
my mother traveled with me all the way to Bombay to see me off, and also my khala, because my mother didn't want to travel alone. And my brother lived in Bombay, so that was no problem. My father also went there. So I had a good send-off, both at the railway station here by the family and friends, and also by my parents and my brother at the dockyard in Bombay. It was very interesting. So my father, who had been abroad a few times, asked one of his managers to go and check up who the other passengers were on the plane, on the boat, and he found out that there was a military officer by the name of Major Ahmed, who my father knew very well. He knew his family. So he said, would you go and make a request to him that he invites me to eat at his table, so that I'm not lost during the meal time. So the first day when we got down to a meal, it was when meat was served, I was not eating the meat, and Major Ahmed, who looked at me, he said, "Why are you not eating?" I said, "It's not, probably not halal." So he said, "मैं हाजी होके खा सकता है, तू मेरे नाम वड्डा मुसलमान है." He later on became a general in the army. He was General Haji Ahmad. He became head of the Pakistan Ordnance Factory later on, a very good friend of the family. But this was a very interesting voyage from Bombay. It had a number of military officers from the Indian Army who were going to England for attending different programs and courses. And this was the sort of the cream of the Indian Army. Both, so we had General Haji was there, and then of the Muslims there was Heskey Beg. I don't know whether you know of him. He was a leading polo player. And then there was at that time a Colonel Iftikhar Ahmad. He would have been the first commander-in-chief of Pakistan, but he died in that air crash. General Iftikhar Ahmad. So these were the three leading Muslim. And then, of course, there were senior bureaucrats. Mr. A.T. Naqvi, who was going to the one of the programs there. He was a senior ICS officer from the UP. And there was another Indian ICS officer, Mr. Vanchu. He later became the Chief Justice of India. And we had Brigadier Cariappa. He was the senior most Indian officer, at that time, and he became the first commander-in-chief of the Indian Army. So he was on that thing. And we used to play deck cricket and, ping pong and all that. So I got to meet all these luminaries from the Indian Army at that time. There was no Pakistan, and there was total comradeship. It was a very interesting voyage and learning, and it was 17 days, and I'd never been on a boat before, so it was a good learning lesson.
What are some of the other activities that you guys engaged in when you were on
mostly
board?
Sports, and of course reading and all that, and walking. It was the ship was called Stirling Castle. They used to have a castle shipping anchor line that plied between Scotland and South Africa. So they had a lot of crew that belonged to either Scotland or to South Africa. So it was quite an interesting experience interacting with the crew on the ship.
Right. Did you have enough money on you?
We didn't have to spend any money on the ship at all, except that you had to tip the people who were looking after the cabin and this thing. But no, I was adequate. I mean, I was not a spendthrift, so you knew that you had limited money. At that time, there was a lot of restriction on how much money you were allowed as a student. And even though my father was a director of the Reserve Bank of India, I didn't get an extra pound for it.
So you landed in Southampton and spent the next 2 weeks in London.
Yeah.
How was that experience in London?
Very interesting. It was one of the coldest winters in England, in London that year. And I remember I stayed in a small hotel on Bayswater Road. Now it's called Coburg Hotel. At that time it was called Coburg Court Hotel. It was a very small hotel. And I was, brought up in here, not used to switching off the light at night. So the next morning I had a two-liner from the manager that, "Mr. Ali, I shall be grateful if you switch off the light when you go to bed because there is shortage of power in England." And there was a distant relative of my father who had a shop in East End, and he had migrated. He came from Gujarat and had settled in England before partition, and so in fact he came to Southampton to receive me, and then he took me to his shop in East End, Whitechapel Lane. I don't know if you know London's East End. There was so much shortage of food in England. There was no butter available. You were given an egg once a week. Meat was either horse meat or whale meat. Official. So, but in knowing Pakistan and knowing Muslims and the way the Indians lived, so they had some kind of an ability to get chicken from the from the farms and cook them, and chicken curry and parathas made in butter. Used to have that. I can still remember the taste of that excellent food that I had in East End. But at that time, my biggest sort of anxiety was to find a passage across, because all shipping was controlled. You couldn't go to the travel agent and buy a ticket. You had to be allotted a seat to go across. So I found somebody who knew the secretary in the High Commissioner, Indian High Commissioner's office. His name was Mr. Dudley Pound. He was a Christian. So I had to go and massage him every day to get me a seat across. And finally, in 2 weeks' time, I got a seat to go across the Atlantic. We landed in Halifax in Nova Scotia in Canada, and then took a train from there to Windsor on the Canadian side, and then to Detroit to go to Ann Arbor. So it was quite an interesting.
How was this last leg of the journey from England to North America
You know,
compared to your
we
other
crossed
journeys?
the Atlantic in end of January, and as you know, in January the Atlantic is very rough. So I hardly came out of the cabin the 5 days, and but the train journey from Halifax to first we went to Montreal and then to Toronto and to Windsor. That was luxurious. There, you know, they're Pullman cars. You know, you are sleeping and all that kind of a thing. And then I arrived at the University of Michigan, and so I spent 2 semesters there, which were wonderful.
Were you excited or nervous?
Yes, very. No, not nervous at all. I was very keen.
Right.
I was the only Muslim at that time from India. There were not, fair amount of Hindus there on the campus, but fair amount, I meant about 50 Hindus. I mean, they were good friends. They were all from Bombay area, Gujaratis. No, there was another Muslim from Calcutta, and he became a very good friend of mine, Nasiruddin. He came from Humayun Kabir's family. And but it was not friendship between Muslims and Hindus. I mean, we were all Indians, and they were all equally, you know. But somehow from the first day I made friends with Americans who generally belonged to Michigan, that area, and we remained friends till they died.
What were your first impressions of the US? How was it different from India and from
Everything
England?
was plentiful.
Mm.
You know, cars were there. What surprised me, I went to one of the campuses. They said there is no room on the main campus. You go to a place called Willow Run. Was one of the abandoned barracks by the American Army, and that had been taken over by University of Michigan. They said you go to Willow Run. I went there, and I was amazed to see that the car, you know, nobody switched switched off the engine. The car was running, and I asked the Americans. They said, "Well, it's the battery is more expensive than petrol here." So these are things that struck one. And of course, there were so many things which were different. Tea was hopeless in America. I mean, in those days, it was like dishwater to drink tea. So you switched over to coffee, and milk was very good. I switched over to milk, and here you put the switch down to put the light off. In America, you do it the other way. So you notice these small things, but you got used to it. And but luckily, very close to the campus, I found a landlady who was very, very kind, very sympathetic, and she gave me a room. And things were very inexpensive in those days. I was paying $5 a week for my room, and I had to share a bathroom with 2 other boys who were renting rooms there. One was a Chinese and the other was a Japanese. So there was a Pakistani, an Indian, a Japanese, and a Pakistani. So, and she insisted on interviewing me before she gave me a accommodation, and she said, "No women, no drink." and no Catholics. So I said, Madam, I'm not even a Christian. She said, doesn't matter so long as you're not a Catholic. They were very biased, but she was an 80 years old lady. And of course, she became very kind to me, and she took a lot of interest in me. And she said, Mr. Ali, I became a widow at the age of 28, and I've never set my eyes on another man since then. And she took pride in that. You don't hear that kind of a sound anymore. And of course, Ramzan came and I decided that I would fast. So I told her that I'd get up early in the morning, and she, I used to come back from school around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was summer, the sun didn't go down till about 8 o'clock. She said, nobody's watching you, why don't you eat? So that was the kind of thing, but it was a very interesting stay in Michigan. And there was we had a common kind of a lounge called the International Students Room, and they put a notice there that anybody who wants to offer himself to go and speak to various organizations, you are invited, especially foreign students. So I signed up my name, and I used to go and address meetings of the Rotary Club and various other clubs, which I thought was very interesting. And I was a die-hard Muslim at that time, so I used to go and talk about Pakistan and about Muslims wanting a homeland of their own and all that.
What impact did your experience in the US have on your identity and on your personality?
Well, it was, here you were you were sort of swimming in a pool. There you were swimming in an ocean. It was your own ability as to how far you wanted to go. So coming from a business background, I knew I was, I told my parents said, forget about getting a degree there. You already have a BA degree, so you can stay as long as you want to. And then they didn't tell me, but I then took full advantage. They also on that board, they said, if anybody wants to go and visit these various factories and plants around an Arbor, the university would make facilities. So I went to see at that time, Detroit was the motor center of the world. You had Ford there, you had General Motors there, you had Chrysler there. So I went and saw all these plants. They even had an aircraft manufacturing plant. They used to make a plane called Stimson. It was a smaller plane, 4-seater or 5-seater. We went and saw that. Then I went to a place called Kalamazoo, where they were making paper. I went to Battle Creek, where there was the center of breakfast foods, these post cornflakes, Kellogg's cornflakes, saw all that. So one got to know how these things were being made and all that. And so it was a wonderful experience to see different kinds of industries and how they were focused on doing things in a very pragmatic way. Of course, I had good friends on the campus itself, and so I had a wonderful time in Michigan.
Could you tell us a bit more about your close friends at Michigan?
Yeah, one was a die-hard Democrat. He was always quoting from Franklin Delano Roosevelt from his speeches, and we used to call him Senator. He joined the army, but his father was in Washington, very influential, so made sure that his son never went to the front. Moving from one training camp to another training camp in America. And that was held against him by our other friends. They said, you are a softie, you didn't go to Europe. Another had been in the American Air Force, and he was a navigator, and he was shot down over Italy. And in those days, if you went down on a parachute, you had a special badge. It was called a caterpillar. It was made a caterpillar. You could wear that badge that I've jumped out of a plane to save my life. So these two were my closest friends. and remained my friends and their wives uh, till both of them passed away, both husband and wife, and both husband and wife. The last one passed away only 2 years ago, wife of this Air Force person. But now we are friendly with his daughter. She lives in San Francisco, and my granddaughter is friendly with her. So it was a very, very warm relationship.
Any dalliances and heartbreaks in the US?
No, 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 no. I was too busy, too young also.
You mentioned you went on an epic road trip across the US.
Yes,
Could you
yes.
tell us a bit more
Yeah,
about
this
that?
was my friend from Lahore, from Aitchison College, my classmate. He came from the Melaram family, Ram Das family, who had a huge wealth of property in Lahore. Just to give you how much property they had, you start with Wapda House, go all the way down to the government house, go all the way up Kashmir Road and Jerton Road back to Wapda House. This belonged to this family. So his name was Suraj Shamsher. He was grandson of Lala Ram Das. So he was in Ohio, and he said, of course, he had more resources. His parents bought him a Cadillac car, a new Cadillac car for $2,200. So he said, I've got a car, now we should go travel. So I said, okay. So I went down to Columbus, Ohio to meet with him, and we started the journey. And his younger brother had meanwhile joined him from Lahore. So, and they had a cousin. So there were 3 Aitchisonians, all non-Muslims, and myself. And we traveled, we started from Columbus, we went to, in those days, the highways in America had not been built. So you had one main route called Route 66 that went right across America. Started from Indianapolis, to St. Louis, through all the way to Salt Lake City, through the national park, and then to the Glacier National Park, to Seattle, down Route 101 all the way to San Francisco, to Los Angeles, and back to through Reno to Denver, and then through Black Hills to see those Rush Mountains where you have the mountains, presidents carved in the mountain, to Chicago and back. We did about 7 weeks, and it cost, I was keeping the accounts, it cost us about $350 for the whole trip. We used to stop over in small towns. Suraj's younger brother and I used to share a room, and we used to pay $2 for a room. It was very inexpensive to travel in those days. Many of the things that I saw at that time still reminded me of what I'd seen later on. Travel itself is education. You learn a lot, see people, how they live, how they dress, how they eat. Of course, America is very standardized, so there were no surprises as far as food is concerned.
4 boys from India in a Cadillac, going through small towns in the US. How did Americans of the time perceive people from India?
Well, except for one day, one particular stay, everybody treated us very kindly. Mostly it was the lady of the house or the daughter of the house who, made the bed or, provided you with sleeping accommodation. And there was one particular nasty lady in Denver. She accused us for taking away her bed covers. And so we opened up the car and there was nothing there. So we went back to the room and the bed covers was under the bed. But she thought that we were stealing her bed covers away. So that was the only negative, sort of experience I had. Otherwise, everybody treated you with kindness, with sympathy.
Okay, Babar Saab, so at some point you moved to Cambridge for a month and worked at Lever Brothers.
Yes, yes.
How was your time in Cambridge?
Well, you see, my family meanwhile had signed up a joint venture with Lever Brothers to set up a factory in Rahim Yar Khan. So my brother suggested to them that that I was in America, could I get some training? So they invited me over. Then MIT is on Memorial Drive. You keep on driving beyond MIT, and that was Lever Brothers' whole factory and head office was there. So I was there, and they treated me kindly. They took me down the factories. They knew I was only 20, 21 years old. So they threw as much of information at me as they knew I could digest. But it was a good experience to talk to people who came from the business world. That was my first exposure. But while in living in Cambridge, I had a friend. I was introduced to him for the first time. He came from Punjab, Irshad Hussain. He was studying civil engineering at Harvard. And then I met Ahmed Shahnawaz. He was studying for his doctorate at MIT. So I got to know these gentlemen there, and so tried to sit with them and meet their friends who were doing higher education. And I was only an undergraduate at that time. But it was a good experience. Of course, these campuses were flooded by returning GIs, American soldiers who were coming back, and under the Bill of Rights, everybody had a right to be admitted to free education. So depending on their own skill and their pre-qualification, Harvard, MIT were all, their places were absolutely chock-a-block full of soldiers and military and Air Force people.
And then you moved for a short period to New York and assisted Sir Zafarullah Khan.
Yeah, that
and
was very interesting
Pakistan's
because
delegation.
my father knew Sir Zafarullah for a long time, and he had a similar kind of opportunity for my eldest brother Syed Amjad Ali, who was studying for his bar in England at the time of the Round Table Conference. So at that time, my father, who was very keen that his sons should get exposure and meet people who were, leaders of the community or whatever they were doing. So at that time, he had suggested to Sir Zafarullah Khan and also to Dr. Iqbal, whom my father knew well, that my son Amjad Ali is in London, so if you need anybody to run around for you, to carry your bags, he's available. So this was a wonderful opportunity for my eldest brother to get kind of a introduction to politics of the Indian subcontinent. And here my father thought this was a good opportunity for me to be with Sir Zafarullah and the Pakistan delegation to the United Nations. And that was really a very educational experience, because to be, at that time, the United Nations was not in the big building that you see now. They were split up into two different locations. For their committee work, there was a place called Lake Success. That was about an hour's drive from New York City. And for their plenary sessions, where they brought everybody together into a hall, was in Flushing Meadows, because that was a big hall, auditorium where they could sit together. So sometimes we would go to Flushing Meadows, and most of the time too. And this was the time, as you know, in 1947, the idea of Israel being created as a nation was being discussed at the United Nations. And all the Arabs unanimously decided to request Sir Zafarullah Khan to represent them. So I had the privilege of sitting through most of the sessions when Israel was being discussed. And all these great luminaries were there. The first president of Israel also was brought in as a kind of a mascot to impress people. He was almost blind, I think, Dr. Weizmann. I remember he made a speech. He was wearing very thick glasses, and even then he had to read through a magnifying glass. And they had a special, big type written speech for him to speak. But it was wonderful to see these. And then, of course, the Indian delegation was headed by Mrs. Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, who was the elder sister of Pandit Nehru. And then, of course, the British ministers were there, the foreign ministers were there, and the American delegation consisted of Mrs. Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt. She was there, and the Russians, Mr. Vyshinsky. I was sort of half pink in those days, so I was very impressed with the Russians. So I even got Mr. Wyszynski to sign a photograph for me. And Gromyko was there as their local ambassador. Later on became president of Russia, as you know, Andrei Gromyko. He was there. So it was very, and in many times, you know, Pakistan didn't have enough people to go and sit on their committee meetings. So I was assigned that, and so it was very thrilling to have that honor to represent your country at the age of 21.
Okay, Babar Saab, take us through your journey back home now from the US. So you went back to England, and then you also spent some time in other European countries.
You know, when I came back to England, I came back by boat. Again, suffered. It was in November. The Atlantic was very rough. But in England, meanwhile, Pakistan had been created, and Pakistan High Commissioner had been set up. And I had a very good friend who was then the Trade Commissioner. His name was Ali Bahadur Habibullah. And of course, I stayed with a family friend, Dr. Qureshi, who had migrated to England around 1920, studied medicine and stayed in England and practiced medicine there. So I was staying with him in Talbot Gardens. I don't know whether you know London. And so it was very interesting. Had one big tamasha that I witnessed was the wedding of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip. That was on the 20th of November. So I went and stood on the mall to see their procession go, and that was a big occasion. But then Habibullah suggested to me, he said, you know, Germany is getting back. Why don't you go to Germany and see if you can line up some representation of German industry in Pakistan? So he got me, you know, Germany at that time was ruled by 4 different countries. There was the British section, there was the American section, and there was the French section, and the east was the Russian section. So you had to get a visa to go to Germany from the British, not the Germans. So I went to Frankfurt, and this was a very sad experience because I was staying in an American mess, and you know, there was tremendous food shortage at that time. And when food was being served, this German waiter, you know, was serving me food, and his eyes was on the meat that he was serving me, and I couldn't eat. And he was starving. I mean, I could see that the way his health was. And so I spent 2 days in Germany, and I said, I don't want to be here anymore. So I then took the train from Frankfurt to Basel to go to Switzerland. And of course, Switzerland was like America. Everything was plentiful. They never went to war. And food was plentiful. And so it was, and you know, it was luxury going to Switzerland. So I spent a week in Switzerland and then went back by train through, you know, Germany back to Holland, a place called Hoek van Holland, and you crossed over by boat to Harwich in England and went back to England. So that was, and then meanwhile, you know, the airlines had started flying to our part of the world. So I got a seat on KLM to fly from London to Amsterdam. And in those days, planes were not flying at night. So you only flew during the daytime. So we flew to Amsterdam, and from Amsterdam we flew to Rome. We spent the night in Rome. And the 3rd night, I think, we spent somewhere else. And the 4th night, I was in Karachi. So very glad to be back home.
Babar Saab, so you landed back in Lahore, which was now part of a new country, because when you left for the
Karachi
US,
and then in Lahore.
Okay, so how had the city changed in the year since you had left, and did your experiences abroad make you think of the city in another light?
Well, Karachi I didn't know before. I had been to Karachi in 1938, but my memory was, I was a young kid. So Karachi was totally new, and Karachi was very small. And of course, I came to Lahore to visit with my family. My parents were here. And Lahore was a city that had been, Lahore with its clothes off, totally denuded. The Lahore I knew All my friends were gone. The shops that I was used to had been abandoned. The place was desolate. Refugees were there, but not very visible. They had been sort of sent to various camps or various distributed all over Punjab. Not many. But Lahore was a very sad town to come back to. I was very unhappy in Lahore because I had very few friends at that time.
Right. But did the city recover soon after?
It did gradually, but I moved to Karachi. I spent the first from 48 to 1956. Yeah, first 7-8 years in Karachi, and then Lahore gradually recovered. And at that time, in the first 2 or 3 years, there was open traffic between India and Pakistan. So you could go across. Friends could come and meet with you. It was not like a fortress on either side. But then, of course, things gradually sort of hardened up, and I got busy in starting work, and that sort of took all my energy and my attention.
Babar Sahib, parting words on how your education from Aitchison through your time at Michigan have molded who you are.
I tell you, every minute that I spent either traveling or studying or meeting added to my learning, because by nature I'm very inquisitive. I'm all this time asking questions. Not that I learn much, but certainly it adds to my learning, and whatever I've done, I've enjoyed. So I have no regrets from that point of view, and I'm very grateful to my family, to my circumstances that provided me all the opportunity to do what I wanted to do and what I've done.
So, Babar Sahib, any other interesting stories from Aitchison that you would like to recount?
We were kept so busy all the time. I remember when during the war, and a very interesting development took place. We had, the civil surgeon of Lahore was Colonel Dick. Colonel Dick had a son who could not go back to school because of the war. So he came to Mr. Brady and said, "Can my son join the Aitchison College?" So he said, "Yes." Then he wrote a letter to the English parents whose sons had been stuck here. And lo and behold, this was during the summer holidays, he wrote, and in the October session, about 60 British boys turned up, and they rented a house here on Canal Bank on Aziz Avenue. This was called Churchill House. So the English boys stayed there. And I remember one of the English boys, his name was Nolda, and we used to have a bell, which was struck with a wooden hammer to announce the end of a period. So he took that brass plate away and hid it. And of course, the whole school came to a standstill. And this poor boy got caning for that. So that was one big prank that I can still remember.
Thank you very much, Babar Sahib. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure was mine.
Are you a proponent of having one SSE in the country which is really world class, which transforms?
I've had a lot of pressure on me. Why did you set up a LUMS in Karachi or a LUMS in Islamabad or a LUMS in Multan? I mean, we can't do that. We don't have the resources of people is more important, and we don't have enough people.